Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most urgent and tense geopolitical developments of recent times. Russia publicly challenging Israel's recent military actions. What's behind this confrontation? What are the stakes? And what could happen next? Let's unpack it. To begin with, Russia's move to openly confront Israel is not just another diplomatic protest. It signifies a shift in how big powers are positioning themselves in the Middle East. Historically, Russia has tried to maintain influence in the region, balancing its relationships with Iran, Syria, and others, while not overtly clashing with Israel. Now, however, we see Moscow accusing Israel of violating international law, infringing on sovereignty, and destabilizing regional security. That escalation is significant. One of the key flashpoints prompting this confrontation is Israel's airstrikes on Iran. In June 2025, Russia condemned Israel's strikes on Iranian territory as unprovoked and illegal, referencing violations of the UN Charter. Reuters. The Kremlin argued that such military acts against a sovereign state undermine diplomatic norms, calling instead for restraint and a return to dialogue. This isn't just rhetoric. Russia has stakes in Iran's stability, especially given its economic and strategic interests, including energy cooperation and arms deals. But we should also look at why Russia is raising its voice so forcefully now. One factor is the broader power dynamics between Moscow and Washington. The United States has historically been among Israel's staunchest allies. When Russia publicly denounces Israeli actions, it implicitly challenges U.S. influence in the Middle East. That's a geopolitical power play. Another factor is optics. Russia wants to be seen as defender of international law and multilateral order, at least in its narrative. Presenting itself as a counterbalance to perceived Western overreach can help Moscow enlist support among countries skeptical of U.S. hegemony. Moreover, this moment is ripe for Russia to deepen its alliances in the global South and the Muslim world. By taking a firm stance against Israel's military actions, Russia can appeal to states and populations that have long viewed Israel's policies critically. That could strengthen Moscow's soft power and diplomatic leverage across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Now turning to how Israel sees all this. From Tel Aviv's perspective, its military actions are often justified as self-defense, preemptive deterrence, or protection of security interests, especially when it comes to Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. Israel has long believed that it cannot wait passively while threats grow. And one could argue that in a volatile region, such actions are standard, though controversial. However, the Russian challenge puts Israel in a tougher diplomatic position. Accusations of violating international law, sovereignty, and disproportionate use of force are heavy burdens in foreign relations, especially when the UN, the European Union, and countries in the global community are watching closely. It may force Israel to more carefully consider how its operations are perceived and possibly restrain certain actions to avoid broader international backlash. We can't ignore the role of global institutions in this crisis. The UN, the Security Council, and international courts become battlegrounds for narrative and legitimacy. Russia's complaints will likely aim to frame Israel as a rule breaker, pushing for resolutions, debates, or investigations. Israel and its allies will counter by stressing its right to defend itself, the complexity of threats it faces, and precedents for military action. This dynamic tug-of-war over legitimacy is as important as any missile or airstrike. Then there's the role of the United States and Western powers. How the U.S. reacts, or chooses not to, will be critical. If the U.S. publicly backs Israel strongly, it risks alienating allies in the Middle East who are watching closely. If it moderates its stance or urges restraint, it could signal cracks in the traditional alliance. Either way, Washington's balancing act will be watched globally, economically, and strategically. This confrontation can ripple far beyond the Middle East. Energy markets, arms sales, regional trade, and alliances may all shift. If Russia articulates a compelling alternative to Western-led security cooperation, some states might edge toward Moscow or recalibrate their relations with the West. Think of nations that feel frustrated by Western double standards. This moment might feel like validation for them. Media narratives will also be central. How Russian, Israeli, U.S., and global media present the story will shape public opinion. Russia will likely emphasize sovereignty, law, Western hypocrisy, and destabilization. Israel and its supporters will emphasize existential threats, deterrence, and state survival. For audiences around the world, framing will matter. When you see images of bombed sites, displaced civilians, or retaliatory strikes, your mindset and interpretations may already be influenced by the narrative you've absorbed. We should also consider that the risks here are serious. Escalation is a real danger. You could see retaliatory strikes, proxy conflicts, diplomatic breakdowns, and perhaps involvement from third parties like Iran, Hezbollah, or other regional actors. One misstep or miscalculation could spiral into broader conflict, especially in a region already saturated with tension. A particularly delicate dimension is how Russia frames this confrontation in relation to Israel's relationships with Iran, Syria, and other regional powers. If Moscow insists that Israel's actions against Iran are violations of sovereignty, then by extension, it questions the legitimacy of Israel's military strategy. That could put pressure on Israel in future operations and force recalibrations of how and where it conducts strikes. Conversely, Russia must also guard against overextending. If its denunciations appear too hypocritical, say, if Moscow is simultaneously supporting or ignoring other breaches of sovereignty, then its moral authority could weaken. Critics will ask, is Russia a consistent defender of international law or a strategic actor choosing its battles? That tension will shadow Russia's position. Looking ahead, what could unfold? One scenario is diplomatic escalation. Russia might push for UN resolutions condemning Israel, demand investigations, or rally nations to its cause. Israel, backed by the US and allies, might thwart such moves, leading to a stalemate in the diplomatic sphere. On the ground, Israel might adjust tactics to avoid international backlash, e.g. more surgical operations. Better civilian safeguards or signaling restraint in timing and targets. Another scenario is retaliation via airstrikes, missile attacks, or covert operations in response to Israel's future actions. That could provoke counter-retaliation, creating a spiral of conflict. You might see escalation in proxy zones, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, or Iran's border regions. A third possibility is mediation or cooling off. International pressure, including from China, India, and others, might push both sides to agree to de-escalation. Russia could try to position itself as mediator, gaining diplomatic prestige. Israel might accept modest limits in exchange for broader support or concessions elsewhere. This could become a temporary truce or framework for reducing direct confrontation. In all this, one constant is uncertainty. The Middle East is a web of alliances, conflicts, and fault lines. Israel's security concerns are real. Russia's geopolitical ambitions are serious. External actors like the US, China, the EU, and regional powers will influence outcomes. For viewers like us, this moment matters, because the dynamics set now could shift global alignment patterns and redefine norms of state behavior. So, when you hear headlines like, Russia challenges Israel's actions, remember, this is not just a single news event. It is a marker in the evolving architecture of global power, diplomacy, and conflict. The clash is as much moral and legal as it is military. How this plays out can influence which countries lead, which norms hold, and how smaller states navigate a world of competing pressures. In closing, I'll leave you with a few questions to reflect on. Will this Russian challenge force Israel to rethink how it uses force? Will the U.S. risk losing influence in the Middle East by defending Israel too strongly, or will it double down? Could this moment be a turning point toward a more multipolar world, where major powers compete through institutions rather than just military might? And ultimately, will international law and norms prove strong enough to adjudicate such disputes, or will force remain the main arbiter? Thank you for staying with me through this deep dive. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think will be the next move? As always, stay alert, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next video.